the Polgar Chess University. So far, in most of the lessons, we have been learning about different checkmating patterns, tactical ideas on how to win materials, or how to promote a pawn, or how to avoid getting checkmated, and so on. In this lesson, for a change, I would like to demonstrate to you a real game, starting right from the beginning position of the game, and how the game typically would develop. And this particular game has been played just about 100 years ago in Germany. And this is how it started. White played e4, which is the most common move to start the game with. What is the purpose of the move? Well, on one hand it is to open up the diagonal of White's light-squared bishop, also at the same time to occupy the important center squares e4 and at the same time to attack the d5 center squares. As in one of the previous lessons I already mentioned, in the beginning of the game especially, to have control of the central squares is rather important. Black responded with an excellent move, also putting one of his center pawns in the middle of the board and at the same time opening the diagonal of the black bishop on f8 and at the same time the diagonal of the black queen as well. While doing all of that, also black controls the central d4 square. White responded by playing knight f3, which is a perfect developing move, controlling two center squares. In fact, in this case, what that means is that the white knight right now is attacking the black pawn on e5. And black better reacts to that. The question is how to defend that pawn. Well, there are many ways to try to do that, but not that many that are good. For example, moving the pawn to f6 would weaken light squares on black's king's side. And white, after developing the bishop to c4, would have a superior position because black would have real difficulty in trying to castle at least to the king's side. Also, white has a kind of nice combination, sacrificing the knight, in which case black cannot successfully accept that because the white queen would appear on h5 immediately, checking the black king, and white would have an excellent game. I think we already discussed that in one of the previous lessons. Protecting the pawn on e5 with the queen, of course, it is possible through queen e7 or queen f6. They both are not horrible moves. They protect the pawn. However, they are not ideal either because, first of all, it breaks a general principle which says do not move your queen out early. Also, it has more specific reasons. On f6, the queen would take away the natural developing square of the knight, or if the queen moves to e7, the queen blocks the bishop's road to development on the f8, a3 diagonal. The typical error for beginners would be to protect the pawn with the bishop on d6. The reason why I do not like this move is because now the bishop stands right in front of black's d7 pawn, which means that the black bishop on c8 will have some difficulty in developing in a natural and good way. Well, the two remaining moves that protect the pawn, which would be either by the pawn move or by the knight move, which was actually black's choice, those are the two best ways. Because at the same time that black defends the pawn, they are not wasting time in purely defending, but at the same time are accomplishing what black should be doing, and that is to develop their pieces and to control the center. Here white has several good ways to continue. One of the most popular ones is to move the bishop to b5, which is called the Ruy-Lopez defense, or also called the Spanish opening. Another typical move is to play knight c3, the four knights opening, and of course the Scotch. And yet another one, the one white chose in this game, developing the bishop to c4, which is called the Guccio piano. Or in Europe, it's called the Italian opening. Here black again has numerous reasonable ways to develop. Namely, developing with a knight to f6 is a definitely reasonable way, although it leads to crazy complications. After knight g5, white can attack immediately black's weakest square on f7. Going back to the position, after white's move bishop c4, black responded with bishop c5, which is perhaps the best move in this position, avoiding the immediate attack of white with knight g5. You may wonder, did that bishop have any other good squares to go to? Well, all the other squares are clearly inferior, just for a simple reason that none of the other squares would control the important d4 center square. You may wonder, how about moving the bishop to d6? One of the typical errors that inexperienced players do is that they overprotect a square or a piece that doesn't need more protection than as many times as it being attacked. So for that reason, moving the bishop to d6 right now, if you'd want to protect your e5 pawn again, is just not necessary. And in reality, the bishop on d6 is not in a good square for the reason I already mentioned earlier, that it stands right in front of the pawn on d7, which would like to advance in the near future to let the bishop on c8 out. Also, if you look carefully, you'll notice the difference between moving the bishop to d6 and c5. From c5, the bishop is much more active. What do we mean by being much more active? What that typically means is the number of squares a certain piece controls or attacks, compared to some other squares where it would be less. So here, if you want to count all the squares the bishop is aiming to, is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 different squares the bishop is aiming to. Let's compare that, for example, if the bishop moves to d6. Now, instead of 9, we only have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So as you can see, that is indeed a significant difference. And then also, even if the bishop moves to e7, even though it's a relatively active square, attacking about 8 squares, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 squares. Nevertheless, the bishop is less active because it does not control any central square. And here white can play in various ways, for example by castling, very common, typical and good move. Or can play a bit more aggressively, immediately trying to take control of the center by playing c3 with the idea to follow it up by playing d2, d4, not only occupying the center but also by gaining time by attacking the black bishop on c5. After c3, black's best move is to develop the knight to f6. But in this game, black made a different move, which is a preventive move. The black queen moved to e7 with a tricky idea that if white follows up with his plan and plays immediately d4, black would trade pawns, and then the black queen would get the opportunity to capture the white pawn on e4 because it's a check, and therefore white does not have the time to capture the bishop on c5. On the other hand, after the white king moves or white blocks the check with one of the bishops, then already the black bishop from c5 will be free to move away to a safe square away from the attack. Naturally, white is not forced at all to play d4 in this position, and he didn't. White actually has castled, which is certainly a good idea. And black continued by playing d6, opening up the light squared bishop's diagonal to get out. It is also important to protect the pawn on e5 because, as we know, white is planning to play d4, which doesn't only attack the bishop that was on c5, but also puts pressure on the pawn on e5. At this stage, already it would be not a good idea to trade the pawns and then grab the pawn, not because white would capture the bishop, because in that case black would do the same, capturing the white bishop, but instead in this position, since the black king and queen are on the same file, if you remember the lessons about the pin, you'll find white's correct move, which is simply moving the rook to e1. If I were black, I would certainly avoid this. Therefore, in this position, black chose the correct move, retreating the bishop to b6. And now white continued, I would say, with a premature attack by playing a4. Well, the idea of the move is to somehow try to trap the black bishop there. If black indeed is careless and, for example, makes a normal developing move such as knight f6, white may just still advance that pawn with the idea that if the bishop captures the pawn, then white would attack the defender of that bishop, attacking the knight, and now if the knight moves away back to d8 or b8, then the white rook can simply capture the bishop. This is called a chess tactic, a trap. Also, if black captures with the knight, which is a better choice, then white could sacrifice the rook for the knight, which is a very temporary sacrifice, because immediately after black captures the rook, the white queen appears on a4 with a check, and then the bishop falls. Let's go back and see how black continued. Instead of playing knight f6, black made the solid a6 move, which is very typical to open some hiding square for a black bishop. And now white made a little bit of a bluff, perhaps, by advancing the pawn to a5, just like we mentioned in the previous variation, with the idea that if the bishop captures the pawn, the white pawn from d4 advances to d5, attacking the black knight, and if that knight moves away, then the bishop will fall on a5. On the other hand, things are by far not as clear if the black knight now captures on a5, even though white has kind of interesting play here, possibly still sacrificing the rook, although after queen a4 now, things are not far as clear as they were earlier, because black can play b5 and attack the white bishop on c4. Although there is certainly some counterplay here for white as well. But let's move on a little bit, because black chickened out and didn't accept the sacrifice and moved the bishop back to a7. It's certainly the safer way to go. And now black hopes on the following move to play bishop to g4 and to create a pin over the white knight on f3. And that pin is really unpleasant, because if the bishop gets to g4, that means that the knight will no longer really protect that pawn on d4, and that d4 pawn will be under attack. And that explains white's next move, when he pushed his h-pawn up to h3, protecting the g4 square, so black can no longer create a pin there. Of course, black still cannot win a pawn after trading on d4 and then capturing on e4, for the reason we already discussed a couple of moves earlier, as white would again create a pin. Therefore, black, instead of going pawn grabbing, simply moved his knight to f6 and develop. This move attacks the white pawn on e4 and, of course, at the same time clears the space between black's king and rook, which means black is ready to castle. And here white made a clear mistake by trading pawns on e5. White should have played rook e1 or some other move that does not open up the a7 g1 diagonal. The black bishop was kind of in a hidden position, but now that the white pawn is out of d4, all of a sudden that bishop becomes rather powerful. White had no reason to do this trade. Black recaptured with the knight. As we'll see, black has some good plans after this. Now, of course, the bishop is under attack. As we know, we every single move need to ask ourselves, what does our opponent want to do? And in this case, that clear answer is black wants to capture that bishop. Also, the best defending piece typically around a king castle to the king's side is a knight that's on f3, or from black it may be f6. So this trade between the knights on e5 certainly favors black. And now black recaptured with the queen, which sets up a cute trap, as we shall see very soon. Here white played knight d2, setting up a trap. Namely, that if the black knight now would capture on e4, the white knight would capture, and if queen captures, again, the pin that we're already so familiar with. But instead, black had a very nice combination. Black captured the pawn on h3, which is a very nice bishop sacrifice. Of course, objectively speaking, white is much better off not capturing this bishop. But let's see what happens when they did. The pawn captured, and now comes white was so important to revive this bishop along the dark square diagonal h7 g1. Now the black queen is able to come to g3 with a check, and that is thanks to the fact that the pawn on f2 is in a pin. It cannot capture the black queen because that would leave the white king under attack from black's bishop on a7. White has no other legal move than to move the king to the corner, and now of course black happily captures a second pawn for the sacrificed bishop, giving a check again and forcing white to move back to g1. And now black needs another piece for the attack. Of course, black could repeat moves, just going back and forth between g3 and h3, but black can go for more than just repeating moves and agree to a draw. So, time to bring the knight to the attack. Now black threatens to move his queen down to h2 and to checkmate. Moving the rook out of the way wouldn't help, because the best move now for black is just checkmate immediately with bishop takes f2. White instead moved his knight to f3, guarding the critical h2 square. Now, the immediate sacrifice of the bishop would not be a good idea, because then after rook captures bishop and queen check, white would not move his king, which would allow a checkmate in one move, but could block the check, and black would be in very serious trouble. So therefore, instead, in this position after knight f3, black first gives the check on g3. Again, the pawn is under a pin. White has no other legal move than moving the king to the corner, and now already bishop f2 gives white a winning advantage. Why? Black now threatens with a check, which is almost a checkmate, and if white would try to get rid of this bishop, then black would just recapture with checkmate. A very nice attacking game for black, and a good example on the things you need to be watching out for, especially not to leave your king lonely without defense when your opponent has a number of pieces aiming at your royalty. Well, I hope you learned from this very instructive short game, and maybe you can use some ideas that black used successfully here in your own games, and of course avoid errors that white made. Thank you for listening, and hope you'll be back next week for the next lesson. Bye-bye.